Story 1. I had a guy walk into urgent care, dragging one leg like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He was moaning, wincing, full dramatic performance. I helped him into the room and asked what happened. He said, "I think I snapped my leg in half." I asked when. He said, "About 15 minutes ago." I asked how he got here. He said, "I drove." I stared at him. He stared at me. I lightly touched his broken leg and he flinched so hard he fell off the chair and landed on the other leg, the allegedly broken one. Full weight, no pain. He froze, looked at his leg, then looked at me like I'd exposed a government secret. He whisper yelled, "Don't tell my boss." "Sir, you threw your whole body on the limb you said was shattered." Story 2. A woman came in demanding immediate treatment because she said her wrist was broken in 4 places. She held it limply and whispered every sentence like she was fading into the light. I offered to take an X-ray. She said no. She said she didn't need one because she could hear the bones clacking. When I asked how the injury happened, she said she slipped while putting on her jacket. Very dramatic. I went to grab paperwork. Not even 10 seconds later, I walked past the window and saw her using both hands to text at incredible speed. I stepped back in quietly. She panicked, shoved the phone in her pocket, and tried to relimp her wrist, but she couldn't remember which wrist. Switched 3 times. Switched again. Eventually just said, "Both. They're both broken." They weren't. Story 3. A dude checked into the ER, insisting he had a concussion so severe he couldn't remember basic things. I asked what symptoms he had. He said, "Memory loss." I asked, "Like what?" He said, "I don't know. I forgot." Fair. But then he pulled out his phone and started perfectly narrating his injury for a TikTok video. Perfect memory, perfect detail. He even reenacted it on camera, complete with sound effects. When I walked in, he froze, put his hand on his head and said, "Ugh, where am I?" I said, "Sir, you filmed a whole vlog about your concussion just now." He said, "Did I?" I said yes. He shrugged and asked if I could at least write a note saying no chores for a week. No. Story 4. We had a guy come into the clinic claiming he sprained his ankle so badly he couldn't walk at all. He arrived in a wheelchair he absolutely did not need because he rolled himself up to the front desk using both feet, actively pushing the floor away. With the injured leg, I checked his ankle. No swelling, no bruising, full range of motion. When I asked why he said he couldn't walk, he panicked and said, "Well, I can walk forward, I just can't walk diagonally." I said, "Nobody walks diagonally." He said, "Then how do people turn?" I said, "With normal steps." He said, "Well, my diagonals are broken." I gave him ibuprofen and told him to hydrate. He said, "So no cast?" "No, sir, no cast." Story 5. A mum brought in her teenage son because he said he was too weak to go to school. He was lying on the exam table like he just washed ashore after surviving a shipwreck. I asked what hurt. He said, "Everything." I asked when it started. He said, "When I woke up and remembered there was a math test." Mum stared at him like she'd just solved the case. I asked him to sit up. He groaned but did it. I asked him to lift his arms. He performed the weakest, most dramatic arm lift ever recorded in human history. Then his phone buzzed. He immediately sat up straight, grabbed his phone, and typed aggressively with both hands like a caffeinated raccoon. I just raised an eyebrow. He froze mid-text and whispered, "I'm cured." Mum dragged him out of the building by his hoodie. Story 6. A man came in claiming he had full body paralysis. Full body paralysis. He told us this out loud. He also opened the door himself, walked to the counter, signed the clipboard, then told me he was completely paralyzed from the neck down. I asked if he knew what paralysis meant. He said, "Yeah, it's when you shouldn't lift anything heavy." I said, "That's not paralysis." He said, "It is for me. That's my version." I told him he probably just had a muscle strain. He said, So, do I still get a doctor's note? I said no. He stood up perfectly fine and said, well then I guess I'm healed. Incredible recovery. Story 7. A woman tried to fake fainting in the lobby to avoid paying her bill. She dramatically placed her hand on her forehead, took a deep breath, and collapsed onto a cushioned bench like she had rehearsed it. She peeked one eye open to see if anyone reacted. 3 staff members stared at her. She shut the eye fast. I walked over and said, ma'am, fainted people don't brace themselves before falling. She opened her eyes and said, I entered a trance. I said, okay, what's your name? She said, trances don't speak. I said, then how are you speaking right now? She sat up, angry, and said, this place doesn't respect performers. Still had to pay the bill. Story 8. A guy came in insisting he'd lost his voice completely and could only communicate by writing on a whiteboard. He scribbled every response dramatically, like he was auditioning for a silent film. Then his phone rang. Without thinking, he answered and said, hello. I stared at him. He stared back. He slowly lowered the phone and whispered, that wasn't me. I said, sir, I heard your voice. He shook his head and wrote, no you didn't. I said, you just spoke. He wrote, that was my twin. He does not have a twin. Story 9. We had a guy who pretended to limp so badly, he was practically dragging one leg behind him. He whined every time he put weight on it. Then his friend walked by the exam room holding a bag of fast food, and the guy instantly sprinted out of the chair to grab fries. No limp, perfect form, Olympic speed. When he saw me watching, he instantly dropped to the floor and grabbed his leg like it had shattered mid-run. He said, it spasmed. I said, it spasmed you into a 40-yard dash? He said, possibly. Story 10. A woman showed up claiming she had lost all strength in her arms because of a mysterious nerve condition. She told me she couldn't lift anything, not even a pencil. Then her purse fell off the chair. Before I could bend down, she snatched it off the ground at lightning speed with both hands, swung it onto her shoulder, and sat back down like nothing happened. I stared. She stared. I said, your arms seem fine. She said, they get bursts of courage. I said, it looks like they get bursts of lying. She said, can you at least write me a note for work? No. Story 11. A man came into the ER holding his neck like he'd been hit by a truck. He told me he couldn't turn his head at all after a workplace accident. I asked what happened. He said he looked down too fast. That was his story. I asked him to show me his range of motion. He groaned loudly, barely nudged his chin, and said, see? Locked. Completely frozen. While I was filling out his chart, his phone rang. He instinctively turned his head a full 90 degrees to look at the caller ID. Full rotation. No pain. When he caught me watching, he whipped his head back to the front like he'd been possessed and cried, ow, it just got worse. I said, sir, I literally just saw you move it. He said, you saw nothing. I wrote, non-injury in the notes. Story 12. A teenage boy came in, pushed in a wheelchair by his mum. She said he couldn't walk after hurting himself at school. He was dramatically slumped, hoodie up, arms limp. I asked what exactly happened. She said, he fell off a hoverboard. I nodded. The kid kept groaning like he'd been shot. When I started the exam, he wouldn't lift his legs, not even an inch. Then his phone buzzed. Kid jolted upright, grabbed it and said, one sec, it's important, and walked outside. Walked. His mum was mortified. When he came back in and saw us staring, he immediately collapsed into the chair and said, the pain comes and goes. I said, it came and went at Olympic speed. Mum dragged him out by his ear. Story 13. A woman came in insisting she had a severe allergic reaction to her workplace because she didn't want to go back after lunch. She held her throat like she was moments from collapse. I asked what her symptoms were. She said, I feel unconsciously itchy. I asked what triggered it. She said, being scheduled. I asked if she had hives. swelling, difficulty breathing. She said, "I feel like I could if I wanted to." I gently told her, "That's not how allergies work." She doubled down and began coughing dramatically into her elbow. It sounded so fake the room echoed. I handed her water. She drank it effortlessly mid-cough and then said, "See, my throat is closing." No, it wasn't. She left angry because I refused to diagnose vibes. Story 14. A man came in holding his shoulder like it was barely attached. He said he dislocated it lifting groceries. I asked him to show me what hurts. He winced, gently touched his shoulder and said, "I can't move it at all." As I walked around him to get a better look, he turned his whole upper body to follow me, using the exact shoulder he claimed was immobile. I paused and said, "Interesting." He panicked and immediately froze like a deer in headlights. I asked him to raise his arm even a little. He said, "Impossible." Then he sneezed, violently, and both arms flew up like he was signaling a touchdown. He realized what he did and slowly lowered them like a malfunctioning robot. He said, "Reflexes. Nice try." Story 15. We had a guy come in holding his stomach, insisting he couldn't eat or drink anything due to a mysterious illness. He said even water made him nauseous on a spiritual level. I turned to grab gloves, and behind me I heard crinkling, loud crinkling. I turned back around and caught him shoving a bag of chips under his shirt. He tried to chew silently, but every bite was painfully loud. I said, "Sir, are you eating?" He said, "No." I said, "Your mouth is full." He said, "No, it's not." A chip fell out of his mouth onto the exam table. He looked at it and said, "That's not mine." I told him he was fine to go home. He asked if he could at least get a doctor's note saying he shouldn't do chores. No. Story 16. A woman came in insisting she had sudden blindness. She was walking perfectly fine. No assistance, no hesitation. I asked how she got into the building if she couldn't see. She said muscle memory. She had never been there before. I held up 2 fingers and asked how many. She said, "I sense maybe 12? I asked her to read the biggest letter on the eye chart. She said, "Impossible. My vision is trapped." Then her phone rang. She glanced at it instantly and answered, "Hey girl." I said, "So you can see?" She hung up and said, "For that call? Yes." Then claimed her sight, left again. It didn't. Story 17. A guy reported sudden, complete hearing loss after getting written up at work and needed a medical excuse. I asked what he could hear. He said nothing at all. Absolute silence. I clapped behind him. Nothing. I whispered his name. Nothing. Then I dropped a pen on the floor. He jumped like someone fired a gun. I raised an eyebrow. He said, that was vibration." I lightly jingled my keys. He flinched again. I said, "You can hear." He said, "My ears have preferences." I handed him his paperwork without a single note of injury. He stormed out, yelling, "See, doctor, I can't hear anything." He yelled that. Story 18. A mum brought in her adult son because he claimed he sprained his throat. His words, he said he yelled too loudly at a football game and now the muscle snapped. I asked him to talk. He whispered dramatically like he was performing Shakespeare. Then his friend FaceTimed him. He didn't know I was still behind him, and he immediately answered in a normal, full-volume voice. "Bro, you missed it. I got out of work for this." I tapped his shoulder. He froze, turned around slowly, and dropped back into the whisper. "See? It fades sometimes." I said, "Your throat is fine." He said, "Can you at least pretend it's not?" No. Story 19. We had a woman limp into the clinic, saying her ankle was destroyed. She said she couldn't put even 1 ounce of weight on it. I asked her to show me where it hurt. Before she could answer, her coffee spilled a little onto her shoe, and she instinctively stomped her foot 3 times to shake it off. Stomped. The injured foot, I just stared at her. She stared at me. Then she slowly tried to re-limp, but the damage was done. She said, "Sometimes pain hides." I said, "Sometimes lies do too." Story 20. A man came in, insisting he had severe back trauma from lifting a grocery bag. He said he couldn't bend in any direction, not forward, backward, sideways, completely locked. I asked how he got into his car. He said, very carefully. Then he dropped his keys. Before I could react, he bent straight down from the waist like a healthy teenager, grabbed them, and stood up again. We both froze. He looked terrified of his own reflexes. He said, "That wasn't me." I said, "It absolutely was." He nodded slowly and whispered, "Can I still get a note?" He could not. Story 21. A woman came in demanding an MRI because she fractured her brain. I asked what symptoms she was having. She said, "I can't think straight when I'm annoyed." I said, "That's not a fracture." She got offended and said, "Are you calling me stupid?" I said, "No, ma'am, I'm saying you don't have a skull injury." She then grabbed her husband's arm to steady herself and said, "See? I'm dizzy," he whispered. "Honey, you were fine in the car." She elbowed him, hard. Then she dramatically leaned against the wall like she might faint. I dropped my pen on the floor just to test her. She immediately bent down, picked it up, and handed it back to me. Full range of motion, zero hesitation. I said, "Your brain seems fine." She said, "You don't know me like that." But I knew enough. Story 22. A man waddled into triage like he had been run over by a bus. He clutched his lower back and said he could barely move. I asked what happened. He said, "I coughed too powerfully." I offered to get him a wheelchair. He refused and said he needed to walk through the pain so it looked convincing. He immediately realized he said that out loud and froze. I raised an eyebrow. He tried to cover it with, "I meant, so it looks heroic." I asked him to sit. He fell onto the chair like a melodramatic theatre actor. Then one of our nurses dropped a tray in the hallway. He stood up instantly, perfectly fine, shouting, "Hey, watch it!" Then realized what he did and slowly lowered himself back down like a malfunctioning transformer. Story 23. A teen came in claiming he had severe, uncontrollable shaking that made it dangerous to attend school. He demonstrated by trembling like a broken washing machine. Very exaggerated. I asked how long he'd been shaking. He said, "All day." I lightly placed my hand on his shoulder to check his pulse. Immediately the shaking stopped. Completely. I said, "Oh, it's better now." He realized he messed up, paused, and then started shaking again, but unevenly, like he forgot the pattern he used before. I asked if the shaking stops when he's distracted. He said, "No." Then his friend outside yelled, "They have donuts!" And the kid shot up and ran out of the room perfectly still. His mum apologized on his behalf with the deepest sigh I've heard in my career. Story 24. A guy walked in wearing sunglasses indoors, holding his head dramatically, saying he had vision failure. He refused to take the glasses off because he said the lights would melt his eyes. I asked when the pain started. He said, "When my boss texted me." I asked him to take the glasses off for the exam. He said he couldn't. Then his phone buzzed and he lifted the glasses halfway to check the notification. I pointed it out. He said, "That doesn't count." Then I asked if he could read the eye chart. He lifted the glasses fully, read the top 3 lines perfectly, and then immediately slapped them back down and said, "See? I'm blinded now," I said. "No, you're not." He dropped the act instantly and said, "So no doctor's note?" "No." Story 25. A woman claimed she had a crippling knee injury from stepping off a curb wrong. She limped hard. Dramatic limping, each step louder than the last. I asked what movement made it hurt. She said, "Any, all, every." Then her toddler ran across the waiting room and tripped. Without hesitation, the woman sprinted across the room to catch him before he hit the floor. perfect stride, zero limp, full speed. She caught him, brushed him off, and then remembered she was supposed to be injured. She froze, turned slowly, and said, "That was adrenaline." I said, "That was you completely fine." Her husband put his face in his hands. Story 26. A guy came in claiming he had acute arm weakness and couldn't possibly return to his warehouse job. He demonstrated by lifting his arm only 2 inches and whispering "ow" every time. I asked him if he could grab his wallet. He said no. Then he saw his girlfriend texting someone and he instantly snatched her phone out of her hand so fast he nearly dislocated his real shoulder. I looked at his grip. Solid, tight, no pain. He realized what he did and dropped the phone like it was radioactive. He clutched his arm and said, "It spasmed." I said, "Into a full speed grab?" He said, "Possibly." No note for him either. Story 27. A woman came in claiming she twisted her spine. She said she was unable to bend, turn, twist, or even breathe too deeply. She kept her body rigid like a mannequin while describing it. I asked how she got into her car to drive here. She said, "I backed in." I asked how she backed in if she couldn't twist. She said she used her spirit vision. Then she sneezed. The sneeze bent her forward, jerked her sideways, and twisted her entire torso like a pretzel. She looked horrified at her own flexibility. I said, "So, your spine seems okay." She said, "No, that was a hallucination." I said, "Of your own body moving?" She said, "Yes." She left without a note. Story 28. A guy walked in saying his foot was completely unusable. He came in on crutches, wrapped his foot in layers of athletic tape like a mummy. Said the bone was shattered into dust. I gently pressed along the foot. No reaction, no pain. Then I asked him to wiggle his toes. He said he couldn't. Then his phone slipped from his lap and landed on his foot. He caught the phone by smashing his foot upward to cushion the fall. He froze. I froze. He said, "That was reflex." I said, "That was your foot proving it's fine." He said, "Reflexes are powerful." I said, "So is lying." He limped out dramatically, even though we both knew he didn't need to. Story 29. A teenage girl came in claiming she couldn't speak at all due to vocal cord collapse. She communicated by typing dramatic sentences on her phone like she was sending messages from prison. When I asked her a question, she would hold up the screen with a slow, tragic expression. Then her boyfriend walked in and said, "Hey babe," and she immediately said, "Hey," out loud. Crystal clear. She covered her mouth in horror and whispered, "It slipped." I asked, "So your voice works?" She said, "Only for people I love." I said, "It worked perfectly for me 2 seconds ago." She typed angrily on her phone, "Stop attacking me." Story 30. A man came in saying he had complete muscle failure and collapsed onto the floor like a Victorian widow. His wife said he was fine all morning until she reminded him they had errands. We tried to get him into a chair. He flopped like a fish. No resistance, just limp on purpose. Then his phone rang with a notification that an online auction he was watching was ending soon. He shot up from the floor like he had been resurrected. He grabbed his phone, bid instantly, won, and then slowly lowered himself back onto the floor while making dramatic groaning sounds. I said, "Sir," he said, "the weakness returned." I said, "Sure it did." His wife apologized to us as she dragged him out.